Hi everyone, it's me, Sierra, the pool toy, here to talk to you about something that might not sound super exciting at first, but trust me, it's pretty much the secret sauce behind getting everything done in life. And so today I'm going to talk to you on the subject of consistency. Now, I'm not talking about like the flashy, like hustle 24/7, always grinding kind of consistency. I'm not talking about like the always perfect every time kind of consistency, but like the real, like everyday, sometimes boring, but actually works kind of, showing up. So why does this matter? It's because your life is what you do. 1% better every day, compounds like crazy. Think about it. If you just improve like 1% every day, in a year you're like 365% better. Yeah. I mean, that's just math. But, you miss a day here, you don't really have a system going on to like, work on yourself and being more consistent in whatever it is you're trying to do, you're going to stay stuck. I felt like this in my own life. I've switched jobs, all kinds of, working on this channel, trying to get better at art, dating, just adulting. The days I show up, even when there's no motivation, are the days that, things actually are improving. So we're covering why it works and how it shows up in the different areas of our life, and talk about some of the barriers that we run into and how to overcome them. And maybe you're multitasking while you're doing this. Maybe you're actually doing the thing while you're listening to this video, and that's awesome. Let's get into it. So let's start with the sciencey, but kind of simple part, which is that consistency creates those compounding results. So here's an example. Two people are working out. Person A works out. They work out really intense once or twice a month. A couple of hours at the gym. They're sweating. They're working really hard. They're really sore afterward. And then you have person B, who does a very solid but manageable routine where it's sort of a light to moderate workout, but they're able to do it a few times a week. Who's actually going to be getting stronger? Well, pretty much it's always going to be person B, because your body's going to adapt to what you do repeatedly, not just, you work on in spurts. And so, small actions and things like repeating them, they also build on each other. You're working out more, well, you're probably also going to start eating a little bit better. My own VR fitness routine with all my squats and my calf raises and my lunges, wearing a vest, doing some push-ups, it's slowly but surely changed how I feel. I definitely have more energy than I used to. I'm definitely able to work out stronger than I used to, where I barely used to be able to do 20 push-ups, and now I can do 50 in one set. And it wasn't overnight. It wasn't over a week, but months, years now. Like, everything improves. The stamina has been improving. My strength has improved. My energy has been improving. And now the habit sticks. The same thing applies when it comes to content creation. You see it with me taking the time to make these monthly videos. You see me sticking through horror games despite how many times I jump out of my chair or I'm just super freaked out by whatever's happening in the game. You see me playing really difficult games where it looks like I'm bashing my head up against the wall. And, sticking to the process is how I can consistently make content and, share it with everybody. It's a consistent schedule, regularly posting on Discord and with my community and on X and Blue Sky and wherever else, that's how I'm able to grow the pool party. And just try for 1% every day. It compounds massively, as I keep saying. If you randomly skip days, you're not going to get that bonus. You're not going to see the improvement that you're looking for. It's not, as glamorous as, just really cranking out a whole bunch of work just in one day and then forgetting about it the rest of the week. But, it's reliable to keep it up. Talent can get you in the door, but, you can, fix up the whole house by being consistent. Now, how does it all look? Consistency isn't one size fits all. It shows up differently everywhere. So for my physical condition, which is a big one lately, between weighted vest workouts, I'll walk on my pad, I'll dance in VR. And, on the other side, I also have like a big sweet tooth, and I'm trying to resist it a little bit better, but consistency is everything. Like, I have days where, I really want that big snack, or I just wake up feeling lousy and I don't want to go to the gym, but we show up anyway. So even if I could only manage to do just a little bit, have maybe a small snack instead of a big one, just to sort of satisfy that sweet tooth. Or I go to the gym and I just have a light walk instead of my usual routine with weights or whatever else I plan to do that day. That still helps keep up the habit, and that still compounds into having better energy, which, I get to enjoy in the rest of life, whether it's streaming or work or anything else that I'm doing. And, oh, by the way, don't forget that consistency also includes recovery days. Rest days can still count as part of the process. You don't have to beat yourself up every day. Just schedule some time to recover for yourself. Aside from things that you want to do, it can also help you with things like in your career. As somebody who works in science, I have to show up and work really meticulously to provide quality data and to accurately perform experiments consistently. Not good data half the time and then bad data the other half. My career growth didn't even happen overnight. It didn't come from just doing the same job over and over again. It didn't magically show up as my first job out of college. I was consistent and, developing my skills, being prepared to work that day, using some of that downtime at work to try to learn and expand my skill set. Also works with drawing too, studying references, practicing art, more sessions sort of beat trying to cram it all in at once. I used to do an art month twice a year where I would end up drawing, for the entire month on stream. But I kind of noticed that, at the start of an art month, my art quality was actually really poor. And that's because between art months, I was barely drawing at all. And so I've now switched to art weeks, where once a month I'll, spend that week on stream drawing. And I noticed that my skills and quality of my work has been a lot more consistent now. And that also applies for everything else too with the streaming. It's sticking to my schedule, being consistent with the kinds of things I stream. I know you guys love watching me get scared or freak out at a game. And, off stream, I'm also consistent in other ways, like making clips, commissioning art, planning for the future, and just working hard at being a better pool toy for you. When it comes to relationships, this one's a little bit deeper. I'm a huge introvert who loves being home alone. Sometimes I'll hop into VR for a nice social fix. And then again, there are times that I want real connections. Spending time with family, dating, maybe someday marriage. And consistency when it comes to relationships means, making yourself available for those kinds of relationships. Spend time with your family. Well, make sure that you're making time to spend with your family. If you want, a romantic relationship, you need to be consistently putting yourself out there to meet as many people as you can in the hopes that, you might find the one person who's for you. and that includes asking them out, and as well as, working on ourselves too, to be better, so that other people enjoy more being around us. Another connection that I also get is I like to go to church, and I feel very connected with the people around me when we have coffee and donuts, just sitting there talking about our weeks. So why does consistency feel so hard? Well, glad you asked. Consistency is difficult because we don't see ourselves transform suddenly. We work out hard for a week, we look the same, we just feel sore. We read a little more every day, and we don't feel any smarter or wiser. We feed ourselves some healthier foods, but only notice cravings for the junk we always used to eat. Your new habits are like a tree. You plant the seed and don't notice anything. Then after a while of cultivating it, suddenly you see a sprout. You keep cultivating it, but you don't really notice a difference day by day. Suddenly, you see it's up to your waist. You kind of notice that it's a new height and you keep cultivating. Again, you don't notice the difference day by day, and suddenly the tree's as tall as you. You didn't really notice it over time, just the milestones. Our habits are the same way. We hit a new record at the gym. We made a new friend after trying to be social. As long as we're consistent, we won't see small changes taking place until we suddenly notice a big change, the milestone, the way that we can kind of measure whether or not there's any progress or not. And one of the great parts about it too is that as you do it more often, it becomes easier to do. That initial resistance you felt when starting gradually decreases until it's nothing to worry about. So how do we keep it up, even when that big resistance keeps trying to keep us from holding up our streak? Well, the easy answer is do the minimum. You can't go to the gym and work out? Fine, do some push-ups or some squats at home. Not even like a lot of them, just do something. You want to just try to keep the momentum up. You can't, take the time to really draw the day. That's fine. Just draw like some cubes and different orientations. You could also work on your environment. I like to put my gym clothes right next to my bed so that as soon as I roll out of bed in the morning, there's the clothes that I'm going to put on. And then once I'm in the gym clothes, it's a lot easier to go to the gym. I like to keep paper lists handy too. I'll have a notepad, a piece of paper to, remind myself of all the things I need to do that day, including the things I do habitually, because it still feels nice to be able to check that off the list. And then it's not an all or nothing approach either. So if you do blow it one day and you don't do the thing that you were planning to do, don't beat yourself up for it. Just start again. Be consistent again. You're not going to be perfect every day. And so when you have a day where you feel like you failed, that's fine. Just get started again the next day. Don't punish yourself either. I've definitely seen it where people, I missed a workout, so tomorrow I got to work out twice as hard to try to make up for it. And then, then they have a really crummy time the next day because they're treating this habit that they want to, build for themselves as, a punishment. And you don't want to associate, the thing you actually want to do with punishment. So just do whatever it is you would normally do. And then at the same time, make it fun. Make it fun. You can't, you want to go to the gym, listen to a podcast, listen to some fun music while you're doing things. Maybe, make it some sort of like a silly game. Can you speed run folding and putting away your laundry? Can you try to, make a record out of it? Just have some fun with it. And sometimes, you got to be accountable to somebody else. You're building up a new habit with somebody, it definitely helps you stick with it if there's somebody else there to call you on it if you are brushing off or blowing off your responsibilities. I hope you already have an idea of somewhere you could stand to be more consistent. Like, what's a thing or two that you really want to start showing up for? Any ideas how you can make it easier on yourself to get started? Like, comment below. And if this helped, hit the like button, subscribe, share with a friend or somebody who needs this kind of reminder. We all have at least a little something that we could stand to be a little more disciplined about. And I hope you keep at it and keep becoming yourself.